Having free will allows us to envision a future, whether for ourselves or for our society, and then to exert our willpower and efforts to hopefully bring this envisioned future about. In this segment, I'll describe possible directions that I think future ethical and spiritual paradigms might take that can offer meaning and guidance to people that are nonetheless not antithetical to science. I will, as well, describe some of the potential dangers religion and science may face in coming to terms with each other. These predictions about the future of science and religion are no doubt influenced by my own personal experiences and struggles to make sense of reality. My mother's Christian and my father was Buddhist Confucian, so I grew up surrounded by aspects of both of these traditions. While I admire the central ethical message of Christ, namely to act based on love and forgiveness, I find it hard to believe many of the ontological claims of religion. Also, in terms of a practice, I find the New Testament to be pretty thin on actually explaining how one is to attain a mind capable of being governed by love and forgiveness. In that sense, the concrete practices that come out of the Asian traditions may, in one sense, help many Christians become better Christians. Some of my scientist colleagues reject religion outright. While I, like many of them, can't be convinced to believe in things that are simply unbelievable to me, I do believe that modern civilization needs a guiding ethical and indeed spiritual framework in order to grow into a less violent, less alienating society, more in harmony with nature and human nature. We can't revert to the lifestyles of pre-technological peoples. We must attain a new harmony with nature and ourselves, embracing technology and science without succumbing to a blind faith in technological fixes for what ails us. Science and spiritual systems will, I believe, gradually achieve a degree of mutually beneficial synthesis. Science will help religion grow beyond its traditional reliance on myth and received dogma. Tolerant spiritualities will increasingly be based less on belief than on practices such as meditation in a community of people seeking to transform their consciousnesses. Such community practices will help us discover what is true rather than be based on received beliefs about what is true. Such spiritual approaches will, in turn, help science grow beyond its present reductionistic paradigm and rejection of experiential insight as a valid mode of inquiry into the nature of reality. In the process of their co-evolution, the paradigms of both religion and science are likely to both change dramatically in the coming centuries. Spiritual traditions compatible with the worldview of science already do exist. It's possible to live ethically without theistic or supernatural myths, just as it is possible to live and grow spiritually without faith in one's own immortality. For example, many Jews embrace Reform Judaism as a culture and moral system of community living while maintaining skepticism toward many of its theological claims. Even though a man might not believe in the God portrayed in the Old Testament, he might still embrace the community and traditions that foster a good and ethical life. Certainly, it's possible to have a moral code of human behavior without the threat of divine punishment. Good need not be defined in reference to forces outside individual conscience. Good can be conceived as that which sustains and enhances life, evil that which harms or undermines it. Such a biocentric, non-theological definition of good will not dissolve all our modern moral dilemmas, especially when benefiting one life involves harming another, as in the cases of abortion or meat eating, but it at least frees us from old dilemmas such as, how can a good God have permitted the Holocaust? And it frees us from the magical thinking that some being other than a human being will save us from the worst in ourselves. Some Buddhist traditions are explicitly anti-myth and anti-dogma. Zen, for example, is complementary to the traditions of science, whereas science, for the most part, is an open-minded, skeptical, and methodical program of collective observation of the outer world. Zen advocates open-minded, skeptical, and methodical observation of the inner world by each individual. We're taught to accept that everything changes, that to cling to things is a key source of needless suffering, and that all we are given is our awareness here and now. We're taught to be skeptical of the ways the mind deceives itself in its attempt to gratify addictions, which are the root cause of human suffering. We're also given a method meditation, which trains our attention and thereby our consciousness, so that we can dissolve the roots of suffering. Such an ethical and spiritual approach to life in no way conflicts with a scientific worldview. Many Eastern traditions, however, also fail to mesh with science in their ontological claims. Most branches of Buddhism and Hinduism maintain that there is karma and reincarnation. Science has found no evidence for reincarnation or any other causality of meanings outside the head, and therefore does not accept them. Of course, science may be wrong, but to say so is not to grant that it is. Given replicable evidence, the scientific community would eventually come around. This tolerance and search for what is real is the beauty of science. If science did not require replicable and concrete evidence, all we'd have is opinions and unprovable, indeed mutually exclusive claims about what's real. For the most part, that is what we did have before the age of science. The data from psychological experiments are quite clear regarding what makes life have meaning. What makes people deeply happy and most gives them personally meaningful, purposeful lives is connection. Connection to others, as in family and friends, connection to what one is doing and the place where one is living. This leads to deep engagement and a sense of fulfillment. Traditions advocating connectedness as the basis of spirituality, whether connectedness to oneself, family, community, other life, the earth, or the universe, are also compatible with science. Indeed, quantum theory, with its recent verification of the reality of non-local correlations over vast distances, lends new credence to the old spiritual view that all events are interconnected. Ecology, as well, teaches us that all events in the biosphere are interdependent. Science seems to be moving toward a worldview in some ways analogous to those of certain ancient spiritual traditions, such as Native American traditions. Science advocates a position that you are related to all living beings on Earth through a common ancient ancestor. Just think, you're related through ancestry to that plant and even to that paramecium. Science tells a creation story where our ancestors emerged from the oceans and the land from much simpler forms. Rather than undermining a spiritual worldview, science is in effect supporting a worldview of deep connectedness among all living things, where we literally came into being in and eventually out of the Earth's oceans, and where we are akin to all life. Traditional religions, freed of myth, sexism, and dogma, have an ethical and spiritual core that can still help teach us how to live. Jesus, for example, had profound teachings about love, tolerance, forgiveness, healing, and wholeness. That many people can no longer accept Western religion's ontological claims does not mean the tradition's ethical and spiritual messages need also be rejected. Perhaps the ethical baby was thrown out with the bathwater of myth and dogma. Is it possible to reform some of these old traditions in a manner that will prove compatible with science and not antithetical to it? I think so, but time will tell. Some ontological claims of religions seem to me to be projections onto reality of people's subjective experiences. Back when we lived in tribes and our worlds were dominated by nature and animals, we were animists, seeing life forces in everything. Then, when we came to live in towns and cities dominated by ruling families, we projected a ruling family out there into the world as the pantheon of gods. Then, when the first empires formed, God was described as a king or emperor, and monotheism was conceived. Now human societies have undergone yet another phase transition, this time not from a tribe to a city or a city to an empire, but a transition to a global society where all human information is accessible in the palm of your hand. Just as the Greco-Roman metaphor of a family of gods became unbelievable to many people, creating a vacuum of meaning that allowed a new metaphor, namely one of God as emperor, to take hold, we live in a similar period where the emperor metaphor in turn has lost its hold on many people's imaginations. If people project their modern experiences onto reality, we might predict that future religious movements will focus on information and consciousness as the essence of reality. Perhaps certain ontological claims from old religions that run counter to claims of science can be reformulated into metaphors that are not incompatible with science. For example, rather than emphasizing that Christ will physically return in a bodily form, which requires believing in anti-scientific notions of the supernatural, Future versions of Christianity might embrace this as a metaphor for the return of his kind of consciousness in human beings. Right now, I suspect most believing Christians would find that view heretical, but in the end, people will vote with their feet and simply stop attending churches that do not speak to them, a societal process of secularization that is well underway in the West and beyond. Non-dogmatic, non-mythological, ethical, and spiritual systems have ample tradition to build upon. Science is not incompatible with any spirituality, compatible with reason. Traditions which revere the connections that sustain life and practices such as meditation will increasingly satisfy people's needs for moral and spiritual guidance. Just in my lifetime, the transformation in society has been dramatic. When I was a boy, I didn't know a single person who did yoga, whereas now it seems that yoga is everywhere. These non-Western traditions will, I suspect, meld with the West's own non-dogmatic, meditative, and mystical traditions such as Gnosticism, Sufism, and Kabbalism. Practices such as meditation and reliance on individual insight and conscience will replace myth and dogma as the wellsprings of religion. Communities and sanctuaries dedicated to rational and tolerant spiritualities will grow, restoring a sense of connectedness to social life and to the processes that support life. But all this may occur against a rising tide of intolerance and dogma spreading through the ranks of the uneducated, the angry, and the needy. All that can save us from an age of intolerance is reason, intolerance of intolerance, education, and spiritualities compatible with reason. The alternative is bleak. We could return to a dark age of myth, dogma, and mind control where heretics are silenced for advocating the scientific worldview or an alternative spirituality unafraid of reason. Without rationally spiritual action to keep us from destroying the connections that sustain our lives, civilization might collapse. The new dark age might not end like the last one did in a renaissance of reason. It might just end. My own view is that there's one encompassing reality, which can be known through public and private observation. The domain of science can be considered the exploration and modeling of publicly knowable reality. The domain of spirituality, privately knowable reality. Both science and religion tend to extrapolate maps of reality formed within their domain to the other's domain, causing misunderstanding and conflict. Science and religion need not conflict, however. For example, a mind is only experienced privately and therefore can be a person's vehicle for spiritual exploration. A mind, however, also correlates with behavior and brain events, permitting the scientific exploration of mind. Because there's only a single reality, science and religion, both in search of truth, must converge on a coherent understanding of reality distilled from both public and private exploration. Where they conflict, science or religion or both are off track, probably stuck again in ruts of dogma. I believe that the vacuum of social and personal meaning inadvertently created by science will eventually be filled by rational spiritualities complementary to a new spiritual rationality. The path to this future will no doubt be complex and turbulent. For one thing, hatred and fear will always be with us because these are basic human emotions. Like a body overcoming disease, each generation will have to overcome new movements of intolerance and hatred within itself. While we can't change human emotions, with effort, we can change the mindsets and social orders that underlie hatred, fear, greed, and cycles of violence. Only to the extent that we become more spiritual and rational will we be able to avoid violent conflict and realize sustainable patterns for human life. Only to the extent that spirituality and rationality converge will we be able to better discern the nature of reality. Thus, my hope is that we will use our free will and reason to fight for the creation of a world that fosters human freedom and the flourishing of life rather than one that undermines or even destroys freedom and life.